You just never know what you're going to get out here, but it seems like we get beautiful more often than not. Even in the summer, we only had a couple of blistering hot days, but it's a beautiful morning today, and there are a lot of visitors with us today. I see some folks that pass through, the Blount family, I think, pass through once a year. It's good to see you on your annual visit through town. I didn't get to say hi to you on Wednesday night, but good morning. And Katie's parents are here this morning. Katie Smith, still not used to saying Katie Smith. I also would just say to those of you who are in your cars, we see you, and we're glad that you're here, and we're glad that we can all be together in this way. I hope that you feel like a part of the group and that you feel connected with everyone. I appreciate very much Tim's prayer to constantly be mindful of those who don't, for whatever reason, enjoy the blessing of being out with all of us like we are. But for those of you who are here in your car, in person, online, however it may be, it's good to see you this morning and welcome. And I would also echo what Tim said in his prayer for Stuart, and I'm not going to just make a big production because I think Stuart will punch me in the face if I do, but only to say, just look around and we're all with you. Just like last time, we're all with you. If you'd like to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, we're going to continue on. If you were thinking that the Beatitudes are finished, I think that in some ways you might be correct, because we're finished with the section about what God says we'll do in order to be blessed. That's the first thing here. This is what God said will bring blessing on his people. Starting in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Jesus tells his disciples, this is how you can be blessed. This is what will bring blessing for you. And then in my Bible, whenever the Beatitudes are finished, there's an extra space in the text. And now it says salt and light. And it starts to read in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. I think that if you would give it just a small second's worth of thought, you could see that this thought really is connected to the Beatitudes that we just read. The Beatitudes are, this is how you're going to be blessed. Blessed are those who. But the salt and light passages are, and if you do that, or when you do that as my people, this is how the world is going to be blessed by God through you. It's really the blessings to the world, the beatitude to the world. And so this morning what we're going to do is we're just going to start with salt. Originally my plan was to just move through some of these passages in a pretty big way. And to say, okay, let's do both of these together. Salt and light. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. And we'll talk about salt and light. But there is so much to say about both salt and light that we're going to break that up and talk just about salt today. This is just a little bit of interesting trivia, I think. It really does make the point. But I learned something about salt. It's really important. Obviously, you know that it's really important. And I think the way that we learn that salt is really important more than anything else is when the doctor says you need to cut back on salt. And so now that we can't have it, or we can't put a ton of salt on our French fries or on our tater tots or the rest of our food, all of a sudden we miss it and we didn't know what we had before. Salt is really important. This metaphor that Jesus is talking about here, when he says, you are the salt of the earth, he's talking about something that's really important. I didn't know this ahead of time, though. Did you know that salt is so important that you speak to its importance almost weekly, probably? Do you know the word salary? However much you get paid at work, this is your salary that your employer gives you. That word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, which is a periodic designation of salt that the Romans gave to their soldiers in order to pay them. Salt was such an important thing that it worked as a form of currency in the ancient world. And so your salary that your employer gives you, that's your salt allotment. This is how much you're going to get. Salt's really important. That's some neat Bible trivia. Take that and share it with your boss and say, I am in a sodium deficiency. I need some more salt. Probably don't do that. There's two main functions for salt. The first just makes the most sense. The first is flavor. This is what we think of when we think of salt. What does it mean when Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth? Probably at the very front of our minds, most of us just immediately think of the idea of flavor. I'm sitting down at a Mexican restaurant with a bowl of chips in front of me, and I salt the chips because it adds better flavor to what I'm eating. I think that this is likely what Jesus was referring to, because in verse 13 he says, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, doesn't that kind of sound like he's talking about the flavor aspect of salt? If he says, here's what you're supposed to do, but if it doesn't taste good anymore, if it doesn't taste salty anymore, you can see all kinds of salty taste references throughout the Bible. I'll give you just one as an example of how this works. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16, I'm just going to read it off my paper. You can turn there if you want, but I'm going to move through it pretty quick. Paul says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. The idea of let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt. It's the opposite, I think, of Jonah's favorite thing to say. Salt and sugar aren't the same, but it's the same idea when Jonah says, hey, maybe rub a little sugar on that. The words that you speak, season them with salt so they taste just a little bit better to somebody coming out. Make sure that your words are not thoughtless and harsh, but season them with salt a little bit. If you think about this in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, with the idea of flavor, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. I don't think we have to jump through any hoops to get this meaning. The idea is something like, if you Christians are made after the image of Christ, and you're living the Beatitudes in your life, and you're poor in spirit, and you mourn, and you hunger and thirst for righteousness, and you're meek, and you're merciful, and all of these different things that we've spent our time talking about, I would think, especially if you're a peacemaker, we spent an entire lesson, actually two, because Dave talked about that one too. If you are a peacemaker, I can see the idea here when Jesus says you're the salt of the earth is something like, when you do what you're supposed to do, you're going to bring just a little flavor to the world. You're going to make things taste just a little bit better if you Christians are behaving in the way that you ought to behave. So number one would be the flavor aspect. And I don't know. I don't know if it's number one that Jesus was referring to. Obviously, for me, when I think about salt, I just immediately go to flavor. That's about the only use that salt has in my life. However, in the ancient world, when Jesus was writing, or when Jesus was speaking, when the apostles were writing Jesus' words to everyone else, it's not like Salt is just some sort of a luxury that everybody has, with a salt shaker sitting on your table, and oh, I'm out of salt, so I'm going to go to the grocery store and buy a package of refined, pure Morton salt from the grocery store aisle so that I can have. It's such an inexpensive thing. We all have it, and we all use it. In the ancient world, it was not so. This is one commentator, Michael Wilkins, talking about this. And the thing that I'm drawn to is how much he elevates this function of salt. He says, the primary use for salt. That's what got my attention. For me, the primary use of salt is flavor. He's saying the primary use for salt until recent years was as a preservative. In a society with no refrigeration, salt could be rubbed into meat or fish to slow decay. And then here's another commentator that says something else that makes the same sort of high-level point. This is D.A. Carson. And he starts this sentence. He says, above all. So we have one group saying a primary function of salt is a preservative. D.A. Carson says, above all, more than anything else, salt was used as a preservative. Rubbed into meat, a little salt would slow decay. And so while it may be most natural to think about salt in terms of flavor, put yourself in the shoes of somebody 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world who is hearing this discussion about salt. And Jesus says to his disciples that you are the salt of the earth. And even though he says the thing about if the salt has lost its taste, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Would it be that the very first thing that crossed into their mind is the idea of rubbing salt on the meat or fish or something to preserve it, to slow the decay process, so that it lasts a little longer than it would have naturally on its own? If salt is meant as a preservative in this text, then it's not, you are the salt of the earth in the sense of, if you live like Christians, if you do these Beatitudes in your life, then you're going to bring a little flavor to the world. And I don't mean like a little zippity-doo-dah, yay, this is fun and happy, but you're going to bring something to the world that's necessary and good. That would be the flavor aspect. The preservation aspect would be that the world that we see happening around us all the time right now, the world is in a constant state of moral decay. It's rotting piece by piece, little by little. And when Christians in the world behave like Christians and live the Beatitudes in their life day in and day out, they serve as a preserving salt function to the world that's in decay. I think if you just start at the beginning of the Bible and start flipping through some of the pages, you can see some of this idea. There is Adam and Eve, and there's the fall of humanity in Genesis chapter 3, and then you come over to Genesis chapter 4, and you have the story of Cain and Abel. And so you have one son who is good, who does what he's supposed to do, and another son, Cain, who is evil and murders his brother. And so it seems like wickedness has prevailed, like evil is going to take over the world. But God gives to Adam and Eve another son who, through his line, comes something good that is good for the world and is preserving for the world. As you go through chapter 5, in Genesis chapter 5, you see this table of nations where it says, and he lived and he died, and he had a son, and he lived and he died, and he had a son. But then you come to Enoch, and he didn't live and die like everyone else. It says he walked with God, and God took him. And so here is somebody living as the light of God in a dark world that is in moral decay, who offers something good to this place where we live. You think about Genesis chapter 6 and the story of the flood, and how everything was just completely bad to the point that God said, I'm going to ruin it. But not Noah and his family. Literally, Noah and his family, who were righteous before God, serve as a preserving factor for all humanity. So the question is, when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, is he talking about flavor, bringing something good to the world, or is he talking about a practical function of preservation. If you Christians do what you're supposed to do, then you can slow the moral decay of the world that we live in. Maybe it's both. Here's somebody just making this case. Salt serves mainly to give flavor and to prevent corruption. Disciples, if they are true to their calling, make the earth a purer and more palatable place, but they can do so only as long as they preserve their distinctive character. Unsalty salt has no more value. That's the real point of this. It's not whether Jesus was saying you as salt serve as a flavor function, or you as salt, when you live the Beatitudes, serve as a preservation function. The real point of Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13 is that if we Christians are not fulfilling our function and doing whatever it is that salt is supposed to do, if we're not salty in that way, then God says you're just going to do it what you do with everything that doesn't do what it's supposed to do. You throw it out. You throw it in the garbage can. Look at verse 13 again and see this point. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. One of my favorite blogs to read is from a guy named Philip Long, and this is what he said about this salt of the earth. He said, whatever the use of salt Jesus has in mind, salt is worthless if it is not salty. So I want to tell you about two things that I learned about this idea of salt and not doing what it's supposed to do, and then we'll finish. Before I talk about these two things, this is almost just like, I could do this in conversation after the lesson, but I won't be able to talk to all of you in this way. Every single commentary or resource that I looked at to help me prepare this material did some really silly stuff with the salt. Every single one of them. This is the sort of thing that you get from this conversation. When Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, this is the way that people write about this. They say, strictly speaking, salt cannot lose its saltiness because sodium chloride is a stable compound. Because I'm sure that Jesus was trying to offer a chemistry lesson to the people that he was speaking to here when he said this. And there are people, especially Calvinists, who have taken this passage and this idea that sodium chloride is a stable compound and salt technically cannot lose its saltiness. What they do is they say that Jesus is making a point kind of like this. This is one commentator. This is a figurative way of referring to an impossible situation, since chemically salt cannot lose its quality. And so the idea is this: if you Christians are the salt of the earth, you can't lose your saltiness because sodium chloride is a stable compound that doesn't break down. And so you have to be Christian. It's just silly. It's silly. I can't believe that so many people have spent so much time talking about this. Number one, two things that I learned about salt, and then we'll be done. Number one, it has to do with this word in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, that's one word in Greek. If salt has lost its taste, the word is used 4 times in the New Testament. And even though nobody cares about what the word is, it's at least interesting to know the word is morino or moros. It's the word that we get moron from. Think about what this is saying if that's all that you know about the word. If the salt is acting like a moron, then it's not going to do what it's supposed to do. If the salt has lost its taste, look over at Romans chapter 1. You can see one of the 3 other times that the word is used in the New Testament. Romans chapter 1 and verses 21 through 23. See if you can spot morino in these 3 verses. See if you can find the word that has lost its taste as we're reading. Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. The word that we're specifically looking for here is in verse 22. Look at verse 22 again. It says, claiming to be wise. This is what everybody in the ancient world who left the Lord and who left his ways, this is what they think about themselves. Hey, incidentally, this is not an ancient world issue. This is what happens in our world too. Everybody who has a better idea, who thinks that they're doing the right thing in spite of what God said or in spite of what God's character reflects throughout his word, those who are doing their own thing, they're claiming to be wise. But in verse 22 it says, ultimately, truly what's really happening is that they became morons. They became morino. They became fools. They think they're smart, but they're really fools. That is the exact same word as if salt has lost its taste. Isn't that beautiful right now? Those of you who are in front, Mike's sitting there trying to swat the leaves off, but from my perspective, it looks like it's raining leaves, and it's really pretty. Salt has lost its taste. If salt has become foolish. Look at 1 Corinthians 1. There's a second use here. It's the same kind of one as Romans that we just saw in 1 Corinthians 1 and verses 18 through 20. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Has God not made foolish? Has God not caused the wisdom of the world to lose its taste? The idea here of foolishness being associated with this word, and you can see something like this. This is R.T. France again. He's one who talks a lot about this in his commentary. He says, a foolish disciple has no influence in the world. And this is especially the case if you go back to the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and you think about the things that Jesus said. These are the things that are going to preserve the world. If I was going to say to you, look at the world around you right now, look at all of our problems, look at all of the trouble that's happening right now, whether it be COVID related or election cycle related, or think about your own home, and maybe you have pretty frequent arguments with your husband or your wife, and we're talking about solving problems. If somebody says to you, I have an answer, this is the answer, this is how you're going to solve the problems in the world, this is how you're going to preserve your marriage, you're going to need to be poor in spirit and meek and humble. You're going to need to have a mourning disposition to mourn the sin of the world and to mourn your own separation from God. And you're going to have a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. I want to do right, even though I so often fail. That's my craving. I want to do it. I want it to be a part of my life. I want to be merciful. I want to be pure in heart. I want to be a peacemaker. If I come to you and I say, here's the list of what we need to make the world a more palatable place, or at least to slow the moral decay that we see happening around us, what would your response be? Okay, cool, Ryan, but practically, what am I really going to do? Thanks for that list of Beatitudes, but what do we really need to do right now? The wisdom of the world is foolishness to God. And when the world looks at what God has said, they oftentimes think the same, that what God is offering to us is foolish and simple and it's not going to work. But what Jesus is saying here, I think, when he starts to use these ideas of salt as either a flavor factor or a preservation factor, and he especially says that if that salt has lost its taste, has become foolish, if that salt acts like a moron from the perspective of what God said he wants his people to be, then the salt is not going to accomplish what it's intended to accomplish. This is John Stott. Such a reversal of human values is basic to biblical religion. The ways of the God of Scripture appear topsy-turvy to men. Men look at us and what we say, and they say, "You're the fool." God exalts the humble and abases the proud, calls the first last and the last first, ascribes greatness to the servant, sends the rich away empty-handed, and declares the meek to be his heirs. The culture of the world and the counterculture of Christ are at loggerheads with one another. And so here we go. Number one, I said I have two things for you. You were hoping I'd be done quick, but the first one lasted a little while. Number one, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, if we don't just take what God said, this is a part of faith, and do it in the way that God said it, and trust that through our humility and through our striving for righteousness and through our purity of heart and through our meekness and through our trying to be peacemakers with the world, that God will actually preserve this place. It's not our job to critique what God said or how God said to do it. It's our job to do it. And what God is speaking to us here is, don't lose your taste. Don't become foolish by God's standards. Number two, this one I think makes a little bit of sense. If you think about it this way, consider the salt that you have on your kitchen table or on your stove. That sits on our stove in our room right now. Consider the salt that you have. And just think about this for 1 second in the world that we live in. It's not like somebody went out into the ground and took a hammer and chipped some stuff up and picked up a handful of pure, refined Morton salt and put it into your salt shaker so that everything is perfectly pure and salt the way that it's supposed to be. For the huge majority of the world, that's not the way that things have worked. I need some salt, so I'm going to go to the grocery store and I'm going to buy it exactly the way that it is. I'm going to read this section because this author says it, I think, probably better than I can. He says, sodium chloride is a very stable chemical compound. I only threw that in to make the point. Everybody talks about this like it's something. I don't think it is. It's resistant to nearly every attack. Nevertheless, listen to this. Salt can become contaminated by mixture with impurities, and then it becomes useless and even dangerous. What was then popularly called salt was in fact a white powder. What is salt in the ancient world is not salt for us today. Salt that we have today is refined and pure and perfectly salt with no issues. It's not dangerous. We don't worry that there's anything wrong with it. But imagine you live in the ancient world with no FDA, and somebody goes down to the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, and picks up a rock off the side of the bank and says, here's salt. You imagine it's going to be just 100% pure, refined salt that's going to be everything that we expect salt to do and everything that we expect salt to be? It's not pure. And so he says, popularly what is called salt was in fact a white powder, perhaps from around the Dead Sea, which, while containing sodium chloride, also contained much else, since in those days there were no refineries. Of this dust, the sodium chloride was probably the most soluble compound, and so the most easily washed out. Listen to this. The residue of the white powder still looked like salt, and was doubtless still called salt, but it neither tasted nor acted like salt. What Jesus is doing here when he's describing something in these people's circumstances and historical context is, you can have a chunk of salt, this white powder in the ancient world, and you can think that it's salt. And you put the white powder on your food to make it taste better. And at the end of the day, all you've done is put dirt on your food. And so you put it on your food and you take a bite and you go, ew. That salt didn't do what it was supposed to do, and you throw it out because the salt, from this perspective, has lost its saltiness. Or imagine this one's even worse, that you depend upon this preservation process, and you go out in the Sea of Galilee and you catch fish, and you rub salt into them because in the off-season you're going to need food to eat when you're not going to be able to catch enough fish to feed your family. And so you take this white powder that you think is salt that's going to do its job, and you rub it into the fish and you set the fish aside. And a couple weeks or a couple months later, you come to the fish and you find out that the fish is rotten because the salt didn't do what it was supposed to do. The salt lost its saltiness. What Jesus is saying in this section is, you Christians, whatever else you may be composed of, you can be really sweet, nice people. And everybody in the world looks at you and says, that person right over there, that person is a Christian. I can see it and I can hear it in the way that they talk. Whatever else you may be composed of as a Christian, if it's not poor in spirit, or meekness, or a mourning disposition, or a merciful attitude, or to behave as a peacemaker in the world, or all of the rest of the Beatitudes, if you as a Christian are not composed of these things that we've spent the last several weeks talking about, then your salt isn't salty. It's just dried up white powder that tastes like dirt, even though it might look like salt. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. This is the thing that I want us to take away from this lesson. I don't want you to take away from this lesson chemistry about sodium chloride. What I want you to take away from this lesson is to go back over the last several weeks, and they're all on Facebook or YouTube if you want to listen to the videos, or I can send you my notes, or maybe you can just open up your Bible and read through the Beatitudes again. Your main takeaway from this lesson is not a lesson about salt. It's a lesson about how important those Beatitudes are that we've been talking about. Because if you don't have those Beatitudes when you stand before God on Judgment Day, then you don't have anything. The salt has lost its saltiness. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I've said this several times throughout this lesson, and I want to keep on re-emphasizing this. What Jesus is not saying with these Beatitudes is that you need to have all of these things 100% perfectly worked out in your life before you can be a Christian and before you can stand right before God. That's lunacy. We're all still working probably on all of these Beatitudes, even those who have been Christians for a long period of time. What Jesus is saying with these Beatitudes is, if you want to start trying, if you want to come to God made after the image of Christ and all of these qualities that we've been talking about, and start trying to be a palatable and preserving force in the world that we live in, then this is how you do it. You come to Jesus. You come to Him in faith. You repent of your sins. You confess Him before this group of witnesses that Jesus is Lord and I'm going to serve Him. We have water in the baptistry ready to go in the building right now. If you're ready to die to yourself and your foolish ways of thinking, to be born again, coming up out of the watery grave, to walk in newness of life as salt in God's world. We would love to help you with that today. Come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.